Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ department is excited to be offering a graduate-level certificate in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. JEDI classes meet the moment with supportive learning that helps navigate an evolving Jewish community landscape. Upcoming courses include Anti-Semitism and Intersectionality, with acclaimed professor Aaron Hahn Tapper, and Environmental Justice and Jewish Perspectives, Land, People, and Power, with renowned activist and educational leader Ariella Ronai Hinich. Apply by January 12th to get in on spring classes before they begin. Just head to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 410, The Golem of Brooklyn. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And if you're listening to us at the beginning of your winter break, perhaps you're in the car listening to this episode on your long car ride to wherever you're going, we're thrilled to be able to be part of that. We'd also suggest that when you get to wherever you're going, tell your friends and family about Judaism Unbound. We often talk about making a donation at this time of year. And by the way, we will talk about that right now, which is if you want to make a donation to Judaism Unbound, go to judaismunbound.com/donate. But we also have asked you in the past to help us out in other ways, like giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and writing a great review of the podcast, which helps other people find it. But really, word of mouth is the best way to get people to find out about Judaism Unbound. So if there's someone in your life that is a potentially unbound Jew, it would be a real gift to let them know about Judaism Unbound. And this would be a good episode to start them off on. We're thrilled today to be speaking with Adam Mansbach. He is the award-winning author of the #1 New York Times bestseller called Go the Fuck to Sleep. It looks like a children's book, but it's not exactly a children's book, of course. And we're talking to him about his latest novel, The Golem of Brooklyn. For longtime listeners of Judaism Unbound, you know that we've always been interested in the importance of works of fiction, whether ancient or modern, as a way of understanding the past, present, and future of Judaism. So this conversation is a chance to expand on that. It's also a chance to dive into one of our favorite fun topics, golems. What are golems? Why does it seem like there's a wave of fascination about them across many varieties of Jewish art? And how does Adam Mansbach, in particular, approach them in this work? So before we get into that conversation, just a few more words of introduction of our guest today. Adam Mansbach is a novelist, screenwriter, cultural critic, and humorist. In addition to the #1 New York Times bestseller, Go the Fuck to Sleep, which has been translated into 40 languages, was named Time Magazine's Thing of the Year in 2011, and has sold over 3 million copies worldwide. He's also the author of the 2 sequels, You Have to Fucking Eat, and Fuck, Now There Are 2 of You. Adam Mansbach's longer novels include Rage is Back, The End of the Jews, and Angry Black White Boy, which is taught at over 100 schools and was adapted into a prize-winning stage play in 2008. Back on the Jewish front, Adam Mansbach also co-wrote For This We Left Egypt, along with humorist Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel, which was a finalist for the Thurber Award for American Humor, and he also is the author of the best-selling A Field Guide to the Jewish People. Adam Mansbach's debut screenplay for the 2016 Netflix original Barry was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award and an NAACP Image Award. Adam Mansbach has served as the New Voices Professor of Fiction at Rutgers University, a Screenwriting Lab Fellow at Sundance, and a Berkeley Repertory Theater Writing Fellow. His work has appeared in publications including The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Los Angeles Times, The Boston Globe, and on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. Adam Mansbach, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Good to be here.
Well, I have to say that I really enjoyed this book a lot. And I'm never really quite sure with a novel what the best way to jump into it is. So I wanted to start by asking you how you describe this book when you're at a book talk. What's the way that you really like to bring people into this story?
The first thing I usually do is explain what a golem is, because no matter what audience I'm in front of, it's not an assumption you can make that anybody is really conversant with the facts on the ground of what a golem is. So what I usually do is explain that in Jewish folklore, a golem is a humanoid creature 9-10 feet tall, crafted out of mud or clay, always by a rabbi or a learned and scholarly and observant man always at a time of immediate crisis. And by crisis, I don't mean the existential existence of anti-Semitism in the world. I mean, like, the villagers are marching with lit torches toward the Jewish part of town. Scholars disagree about the precise incantations, prayers, recipes involved in making a golem. One thing that is consistent in the mythology is that the final step always involves the Hebrew word for truth, which is either written on the golem's forehead or written on a piece of paper, which is then inserted into the golem's mouth, at which point the golem animates. I try to avoid using the words alive or dead in reference to the golem because, strictly speaking, he's neither one. He's simply up and about or not. And he does the bidding of his creator or fails to. Frequently, the golem is not obedient. He's certainly the ancestor of Frankenstein's monster in that sense. Usually, he's tasked with the martial defense of the Jewish people, as was the case with the Golem of Prague, widely considered the Michael Jordan of golems, but it could also be manual labor, which was the task appointed to the Golem of Helm, largely considered the Scottie Pippen of golems.
I thought you were going to say the LeBron James of golems. So Scottie Pippen's not like the second best player ever, just the second best player on the Bulls.
I mean, I'm from Boston, so if we're going to go in that direction, I might say the Bill Russell of golems. But I digress. In any case, when the golem's job is done, the aleph is erased from the word truth, turning it into the word death, and the golem returns to an inchoate state of mud or clay. The golem of Brooklyn differs from that historical mythological golem in some significant ways. First of all, he is not made by a learned or scholarly or rabbinic man, nor is he made at a time of crisis. He is made by a guy named Len Bronstein, who's an art teacher in Brooklyn, who happens to have a lot of clay on hand and is extremely stoned. And there's no crisis at hand. Len is just...
That he knows of.
That he knows of. Nothing immediate. Nobody has a torch and is marching toward his house that we're aware of. And the golem comes to life and starts screaming at Len in Yiddish, which is a language he does not speak, and trashing his apartment. And Len manages to calm the golem down by parking him in front of a television set playing an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and runs out to find a translator. The only Yiddish speaker he knows in the area is a woman he's never spoken to who works at a local bodega, who he once heard curse out some yeshiva kids who came in to buy cigarettes. So he goes and hits her with the somewhat sketchy prospect of coming back to his weird apartment to translate for his golem. Eventually, the golem learns to speak English by binge watching Curb Your Enthusiasm after ingesting a large amount of LSD. And we learn a couple of important things about the golem. One is that what he's been screaming at Len is mainly two things. One is, where's my dick? Because Len failed to make him a dick. And the other is, where's the crisis? And Len doesn't really have answers for either one of these things. The other thing that we learn at this juncture is that this golem, unlike the golems of Jewish lore, is a creature in possession of an ancestral memory. So Len has not made but remade this golem. There's only been one golem throughout all of history, and he remembers every previous iteration of himself. He has memories that date back to the dawn of creation and ancient Egypt and 5th century Babylon. And as such, he's sort of a repository of Jewish memory and history and trauma. So that's sort of the beginning of the book, and things unfold from there.
I'm only familiar with the Golem of Prague in terms of an actual golem story. And I was curious, like, how many of the previous golems that you mention in the book are actually in Jewish lore in different places? Like, how did you find them? And what brought you to be writing about this story of a golem?
Almost all, I would say 95% of the golem stories that I tell in the book, in that one chapter, Thrash Memory, which is kind of a proposed history of golems that purports to offer different possibilities as to when the first golem was made, almost all of that is made up. I did sort of search through all of the golem lore in search of stories that I felt were worth including in that chapter. And I think the only one from that chapter that I didn't just make up out of whole cloth is the one about the Grand Rebbe of Odessa having a golem to accompany him through the treacherous countryside and keeping the golem with him for like years, but always deactivating him for the Sabbath so that the golem doesn't desecrate the Sabbath. That one is real. Every single other one, the Moses story, the Solomon story, Mattathias story, the Constantinople story, all that shit is just stuff I made up. In terms of how I came to write this book, what often happens for me in terms of my process is that I will be noodling on a couple of disparate ideas at the same time. And the spark is often when I realize how they are connected. In this case, I was sort of toying with simply the comic premise of a guy who is totally unqualified to make a golem making a golem. And the idea that the golem would like scream at him in Yiddish and trash his apartment. I just thought that was funny. But also that clearly is not a novel. That is a Saturday Night Live skit. Specifically the kind that's like really funny for 2 minutes and then gets very tiresome and lasts for like another 9 minutes. And you're like, when is this going to end? Like, is there a musical guest coming? Like, how do we get out of this? They clearly had no idea where they were taking this. So that was idea number one. Idea number two, a kind of speculative future sci-fi novel about epigenetics.
Yes. Okay. I was going to ask you, because there's a hypothetical novel in your novel, and it felt like one that you would have actually thought about writing. So this is confirming my thought on this front.
100%. I cop to this in the acknowledgments even. The novel that Len cannot figure out how to write in chapter 1 is, in fact, the novel I could also not figure out how to write. Also, I felt like by making 90% of the first chapter of this book the summary of an unrelated novel that doesn't exist, it kind of sets the contract with the reader. I'm a big believer that any work of art very quickly establishes terms with its reader, viewer, listener, lets them know to some extent what they're in for so that they can make the decision to keep rolling or like run away in terror. This novel is going to be propulsive, but also digressive, that it's going to involve stories within stories. In true Talmudic fashion, you can expect a lot of tangents. Might ask yourself at certain points, what the fuck does this have to do with anything? In any case, the novel I was trying to work out and that Len in the book is trying to work out begins with the fact that epigenetics is an increasingly accepted scientific premise. The idea that trauma interacts with the DNA, kind of flips switches in the DNA, and that trauma is thus passed down generationally. Your trauma can be passed to your children and theirs. I started sort of thinking about the next series of innovations and where they might lead legally, morally, societally. So like if epigenetics is real, maybe the next thing that somebody figures out how to do is pinpoint the exact moment when that trauma enters the genetic record. The way that when you cut down a tree and look at the rings, you can see where the like fire happened that almost killed the tree. And if you could do that, then you could start to litigate, right? You could start to sue for damages. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew and that epigenetic trauma entered at a moment when there was a pogrom or a slaughter, if you're of African descent and that epigenetic trauma pops up during Middle Passage or enslavement, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, it started getting increasingly florid and wacky. Well, then what if people learn how to transplant that trauma from one person to the next? And what if the people on the receiving ends of those transplants begin to actually experience the memories of the thing that caused the trauma? I got pretty far afield in trying to puzzle this out. But what I didn't have was a plot or any characters. And, you know, not to be too technical here, but you tend to need those things to write a novel. And then one day I woke up with the realization that if the golem was a figure with an ancestral memory, then I could do most of what I'd really been wanting to do in that epigenetics novel through the vehicle of the golem. You know, golem is often translated as unfinished thing. The word golem appears once in the Torah, not in reference to the creature, but in reference to Adam before God breathes the breath of life into him. And a golem is an unfinished thing. But another translation you sometimes see is empty vessel. So my big realization was that I could make my golem a very full vessel, full of history and trauma. And when those two ideas came together, I sat down and very quickly wrote like a 5-page outline of the book, which I sent to my agent, who responded with a 1-line email, which said, "The golem market is dead." I was like, cool.
And that also made its way into the book in a later scene. That's amazing. I love that, especially, and I shared this before we started the episode, but now I have to share it to our listeners. I was saying for a long time, buy stock in golems to a lot of people. My sense was that there were a lot of folks interested in the golem for a variety of cool reasons. And we had an episode in the past with Julie Whites, who made these amazing videos where she embodies a golem and goes and fights like climate change and all sorts of cool activist stuff. And there's been others who have written books tied to golems. Lately, I have started to sense like, are we reaching the end of our golem era? But I think there's actually more and more proof that golems continue to fascinate people. I received your book as being in conversation with, this is going to be out of left field, with Russian Doll, the Netflix show starring Natasha Lyonne, which also is anchored very firmly on epigenetics and on time travel, which this book is, it's not quite time travel what your book does, but the golem sort of time travels because it's the same golem who has appeared in every era of Jewish history. And it felt like it was and I'm saying this as somebody who has advocated for us to see Natasha Lyonne as a rabbi, as like, this is only meant to like be a huge compliment. But I wanted to get a little bit into that piece of this golem because I'm glad you started by talking about epigenetic trauma, because that, if I remember right, is actually like the first chapter and then the golem appears in the second chapter. Am I remembering that properly?
Yeah, that's the first chapter.
Okay, so yeah, because I remember starting and being like, oh, wait, I just read the book jacket or whatever, and that was talking about the first thing being a golem arriving, and then it was epigenetics, and I was like, oh, juicy, interesting. But then you don't explicitly, it's not like preachy where you come in at the end of the book and you're like, and here's why epigenetics was the first chapter of the book. It's much more like you plant that seed, and then I think we as readers are trusted to make the connections between this golem who has experienced literally trauma after trauma after trauma in era after era after era, and tie that to the epigenetics conversation that you brought in. But I'd love to hear a little of that preachiness from you in this context of a podcast. Like, what were some of the things you were seeking to convey with that opener? Because you just as easily could have started with the golem arriving and then throw in the epigenetics thing in chapter 15 or whatever as an interesting interlude. You didn't do that. It was the first thing we heard.
Yeah. I actually was very into the weirdness of starting the book with a summary of another book. Some of the writers I like best are writers who really break all of the rules and do things narratively and structurally that are extremely bugged out and conform to almost a dream logic or a logic that is hard to quantify. And I think the other reason is because to bring epigenetics in any later would have taken on, as you suggest, a different kind of didacticism. If we already know that the golem is here and he has an ancestral memory, we might be inclined to view Len's failed novel in a different light, and it might seem a little on the nose. And I think by inverting those things and starting with Len's novel before we really get to the golem or deal with the golem, it upends that a little bit and gives you like an intellectual template for some of what's going to happen or be grappled with in the book without making it feel overdetermined. It also helped me start writing downhill. I do a lot of outlining. I try to be very prepared before I begin a novel, because if I'm not, it takes me about 20 times as long, literally. I learned that with my third novel, which I went into utterly unprepared, and it took me like 4 years to write. And this novel, I made sure I knew exactly what I was doing chapter by chapter, and I wrote it in like 3.5 months.
Do you think as a writer, there's a difference between the thing that a writer is trying to do, who comes into a novel, as you say, unprepared, and just kind of lets it go where it goes? You know, you hear from other writers who talk about that the characters come alive and they decide where they want to take you, versus somebody who's coming into the writing process of the novel having already written an outline and a treatment. And I would imagine that when you do that, it's a lot more clear to you what the novel's larger purpose is, like what are sort of the ideas that it's trying to say. So I guess I'm asking more broadly, like as a novelist, are you really trying to kind of incept a certain set of ideas in your reader? Or are you really just trying to tell a story that's enjoyable and has some meaning? Or how do you imagine the experience of the reader should be reading one of your novels?
I've always gravitated toward writing books that, in my mind anyway, had some kind of social purpose, some kind of appetite for grappling with the larger issues. You know, I've written a lot about race and about whiteness. I've written a lot about hip hop. I've written a lot about identity. At this point, I've written a lot about Judaism. I came up in hip hop, so art that was overtly political is really what I cut my teeth on. And in no way would I be the person or the writer I was if I hadn't been digesting a diet of Public Enemy and Boogie Down Productions when I was 12 years old and figuring out how to take, childhood concepts like fairness, and instead of primarily concerning myself with fairness to me, direct them outward toward the world and think about fairness, equity toward other people. So like, I've always had a certain conception of a novel as engaging with the world in a profound way, not being solipsistic or navel gazing, having the courage and the appetite for something larger. That said, I also think that literature should raise more questions than it answers. So I'm not overly concerned with being prescriptive or like having you close the book with a clear vision of how exactly you should act or how exactly you need to change your life. Again, much like the Talmud, which was a big influence on this book, there's no agreement to be had and no resolution to be found more often than not. In terms of outlining versus going in cold and what you said a moment ago about like that sort of chestnut that, characters come alive and surprise you. In my mind, those two things are not contradictory in any way. You can be extremely prepared and still have your characters surprise you. They're just going to surprise you in more germane ways if you actually know who they are. You got to know what the chords of the tune are to go and solo over them. Nobody just goes in like blind with no idea what's going on. Like there are always parameters and precepts that you have to adhere to or work with. In the case of this book, for example, the kinds of ways that the characters surprise you are, in your outline, you might say like, all right, Len and Miri face off over the question of whether to drive the Golem to Kentucky to attend a white nationalist march. Cool. There's the question of whether the Golem intends to merely scare these racists or if he intends to rip off their heads and fuck their necks, as Larry David suggests that he might want to do. Spoiler alert.
That's literal Larry David who plays a role in this book. For those who are like, do they mean in a metaphor? No, like Larry David's in this book.
Larry David's in the book. Anyway, I might have in my notes that they have this argument, but probably even if I tried to script that argument out ahead of time, there's going to be a stratum or several strata beyond what I thought I knew about what they were going to say that I haven't realized until I'm in the moment. And I realize that the argument doesn't end where I think it does. I think if you're alive to the possibilities of character and just the possibilities that the novel begins to offer up, your outline recedes a bit and you allow that spontaneity to interact freely with it.
You probably didn't mean it this way, but I think that's a good teaching for good Jewish ritual, by the way, not just good writing. Like there is a visioning, there is a scaffolding, but maintaining that space for surprise is really critical. So I was not, nobody was asking for my like drash or application of this, but I think that's there.
I appreciate that.
I want to talk a little bit about some of your characters that are not just the Golem. We've gotten a little bit of a window into the Golem, which is super helpful. And by the way, I keep saying the Golem because there's a whole thing in the book about whether you say the Golem or Golem.
The Golem insists on being referred to as the Golem, refers to himself always as the Golem as well.
There you go. Great. So your characters, you mentioned a couple of them just now. Len, Miri, they are definitely the two most, protagonistic, if that's a word. Len is the protagonist. Miri is, if we were like scripting the movie, Miri would definitely have the second most screen time, I think. And then after that, there's a number of folks, but I'm kind of interested in this guy, Waleed, who is a friend of Len's that is not a super huge character in the book. But I'd love to hear just your window into these folks and to like lay a little bit of groundwork. What I loved about them is, so A, none of them are rabbis. We think rabbis have a role to play, but in Jewish literature, they tend to get more space than their percentages in the Jewish population would call for. And Len and Miri, Len is Jewish, but he describes himself at one point as culturally Jewish. Miri is a formerly ultra-Orthodox Hasidic Jew who still identifies as religious. There's a moment where she actually says that. She's asked, "Are you religious?" She thinks for a second, says yes, even though she has actively left a certain kind of religious community. So I'd love to get a little window, like obviously a general idea of telling a cool outside the box creative Golem story is one piece, but you made really conscious choices about which characters would be interacting with that Golem too. And so I'd love to hear from you on those characters.
So Len Bronstein, the creator of the Golem, he does in fact describe himself at one point as culturally Jewish because Miri on her way back to his apartment after just meeting him and learning that he has built a golem, presses him on exactly how he identifies. It crosses her mind that he might not even be Jewish, which is terrifying to her for reasons she can't even articulate. Anyway, Len is like, I'm culturally Jewish. And Miri's like, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means. Whereas Miri, as you say, grew up in this ultra-Orthodox Hasidic sect, which she left the moment she turned 18 because Miri is gay. And that is not an atmosphere conducive to being openly gay. So she's been very much on her own ever since. She's working in this Yemeni bodega. She relocated just outside the meniscus of the bubble in which she grew up. Len leads a very secular and somewhat cosmopolitan life. His best friend, as you mentioned, is Walid, who is a Lebanese guy who is not just Len's homie, but also his drug dealer, who is the reason that the Golem gets his hands on a vial containing 50,000 doses of LSD, and is very much Len's interlocutor and running buddy on various side stories that get told in the book, including a story that takes the two of them to Sweden to confront a VRBO scammer who has compromised Len's apartment. You know, what I wanted to do, among other things, was put these kinds of Judaism and these kinds of Jews in dialogue with each other and let them bump up against each other in different kinds of ways. For Len, although he's not religious, he has deeply held values that to him are quintessentially and importantly Jewish. And he evokes them to explain his reluctance to let the Golem run amok. By the end of the book, Len and Miri are kind of on opposite sides of a dilemma. They realize that they basically have two choices. They can let the Golem slaughter the enemies of the Jews, in which case they might be safe. But in which case, as Len says, they may also no longer be Jewish. This action may be so anathema to their most important values that the thing that they're trying to defend may cease to exist in its defense. And the other option is to erase the aleph and make the Golem return to a state of being mud.
And just to specify that, when you erase an aleph with the Golem, the word is emet, and so erasing the aleph creates the word met, which means dead in Hebrew.
Yeah. Right, thank you. You know, and in this moment, Len finds himself digging deep into his barely remembered bag of tricks, the thing he wrote his bar mitzvah speech about, and evoking the idea of tikkun olam, repairing the world. He's like, Miri, what about tikkun olam? Miri is like, schmuck. Has it ever occurred to you that maybe this is how we repair the world, i.e. slaughtering these white nationalist motherfuckers?
Yeah, I really appreciated that element of Len. He felt deeply familiar to me. He reminded me of a lot. One good thing to know about me that drives a lot of how I Jewish is I am not a New York Jew, but both of my parents are. I grew up in Milwaukee, but both of my parents are from New York. So I'm on this interesting membrane between folks who are New York Jews and very much in that, and also folks who are deeply outside of it. And so I spent a lot of my time thinking about this, what makes New York Jews different from other Jews? And Len, the way he drew on Jewish textual tradition felt totally right to me. And I'm not saying this to diminish folks, but there's a certain set of folks for whom Jewish textual tradition, that's not how they Jewish, mostly. For Len, I don't think his driving force in how he exists as a Jew is about quoting Hillel the Elder or Tikkun Olam. I think he has a lot of, like you said, culturally Jewish ways of embodying that identity. But especially with folks in New York or other high-density Jewish areas, there are certain things that soak into you. There are certain aphorisms, certain teachings, certain whatever, even if you're not a synagogue-going Jew. And
even if you're not a Jew.
Yeah, that's true. And that's, the famous Lenny Bruce thing of even if you're not Jewish, you're Jewish in New York.
Right.
But one moment where that happens super explicitly is, I believe it's Miri is in the midst of telling a famous joke about, there's this Jew on a desert island who's trapped for 20 years and they reached him miraculously and they're going to rescue him. We've talked about this on the podcast in the past. Don't send us emails that we tell it too much. We're going to keep telling it in the future. And they find this guy and he's built all sorts of little buildings on the island. He shows the building. Oh, here's a synagogue. Here's the synagogue I go to. And then here's the second synagogue that I never set foot in. And when Miri's telling that story, Len interrupts and finishes it as if to say, don't assume I don't know that story just because you're like the formerly Orthodox Jew and I'm culturally Jewish. Like, no. I know that story and it matters to me just as much as you. And it felt really sincere. And it felt to me, and even the way you use Larry David and Curb Your Enthusiasm, like it felt to me like you were asserting implicitly that this cultural Judaism is not just a joke. It's not just people sort of half-assing Judaism. It's a real thing. And so I was curious to hear from you on that because Len is marked specifically as not a rabbi, but there are a couple moments where there's sort of soft implications that he might be special in his Jewishness in some other way. But tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you've got my mind racing in a bunch of different directions because that's all very interesting. And on one hand, deeply embedded in Len, despite his lack of interest, lack of observance, lack of study, that's how deeply rooted some of the experience of text and storytelling is in Jewish culture, is that it's inescapable and going to be part of your purview and your consciousness, even if you've made no conscious attempt. Len quotes Hillel the Elder. Miri is a little bit shocked, but like the quote is so pervasive that you would almost be more shocked if Len or anybody who's even nominally Jewish didn't know it. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Len, of course, subverts this. He's saying it as he's stealing the keys to an SUV that he intends to essentially steal from the fixer of the Grand Rebbe of the Hasidic sect that Miri grew up in so that they can take it and drive the Golem to Kentucky. But he knows this bit of it's not scripture, but it might as well be. Yeah, I certainly would make the argument. I'm against ranking Judaisms. You know what I mean? I'm against playing who's more Jewish than who. The notion that just because you are better read or more observant, you are somehow more Jewish, I think is problematic. For me personally, for years and years and years, and still to this day, although I am considerably more learned than I used to be, my main point of entry to Judaism was through the work of Jewish artists. Cultural Judaism, the entire litany of writers I grew up reading, incredibly important, much more so than perusal of the Torah or the Talmud. And I don't think that should be discounted. I think that one of the fascinating and beautiful things about Judaism is the fact that, as I believe I say in the book, it is the Hotel California of religions. You can check out, but you can't leave. There's really no mechanism by which to leave. As disaffected as you might feel, you're still Jewish. You got Jews saying stuff like, I'm Jewish, but I'm Buddhist. Episcopalians don't say shit like that. The margins of the Jewish community, the places where people feel ambiguous, ambivalent, conflicted, they've got a foot in but a foot out, they don't feel fully at home. Those margins are very well populated, a lifeboat bigger than the ship. And every community has margins, but the nature of Judaism lends itself to particularly large margins, and that tends to be where particular kinds of insight come from. The point of view, the perspective you have from those margins, through your separation, through the pain that's inherent to that separation, the level that you have to be observant, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of watching what's going on around you, is heightened in those places. And that's where a Jewish artistic tradition that I see myself in largely comes from. I'm very much a proponent of the importance of cultural Judaism. And I think Len connects with that almost instinctually. And, Miri, it's foreign to her. The idea that such a thing could even exist is anathema to the way she grew up. These formulations that we hear all the time, like, oh, all New Yorkers are Jewish, or, like the Lenny Bruce routine, balls are Goyish, tits are Jewish. Miri's like, fuck all that shit. You know what's Jewish? Being Jewish is Jewish. You don't get to make up your own rules and have some deeply felt set of concepts that you just feel are Jewish, even though you never set foot in a synagogue or read a goddamn thing that is Jewish. You don't get to do that. She's much more of a believer in a certain kind of structure and hierarchy, even though that structure and hierarchy was so oppressive that she couldn't live within its confines, and she left and never turned back.
So our friend of ours, personally friend of the pod, Amichai Levi, talks a lot about this idea, or he used to talk about this idea of artists are the new rabbis, Then he became a rabbi and he started talking about rabbis are the new artists. So I don't know exactly.
That's my man. Amichai is my buddy.
So maybe we could ask him what that means together. But I always like the idea of artists are the new rabbis. And I'm curious about particular types of rabbinical school that artists might go to. And yours strikes me as an interesting one. Like you said earlier, that you spent a lot of time in the world of hip hop. What ways are you thinking about Judaism differently because you came to it through hip hop?
Certainly one of the ways that hip hop has influenced my conception of Judaism and what I bring to this book is that I've spent a lot of time thinking about the relationships in this country between Black folks and Jews, which is not to say that those are separate categories. There are 1 million Jews of color in this country. And of course, the normatization of Ashkenazi Jews in this country is profound and is also a form of erasure of Mizrahi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Black Jews, Asian Jews, all of which very much exist. That said, charting the Civil Rights Alliance, the various ways that it became fractured and fissured in my own lifetime has been formative work for me. And hip hop as a liberatory movement, as a site that was making whiteness visible in American life at a time when very little else was. When I was a kid in the late 80s and the early 90s, hip hop was the only place that was addressing the kind of de facto segregation I saw all around me, or addressing police brutality, or the need to divest from apartheid South Africa, or the Eurocentricity of history education in the public schools. All of these things shone a spotlight on whiteness, made it subjective, non-normative for the first time. I also grew up in a pretty Jewish community, so the overlap between Jewishness and whiteness was one I took for granted. And a lot of my anger toward lip service that was paid toward progressive ideals by white people, but that stood in stark contrast to like their clear discomfort when they were in a room full of Black people, for example. But, you know, as I've delved more deeply into the fascinating and fraught history of political and artistic collaboration between Black folks and Jews in this country, the ways in which those political alliances have been strained, and the ways in which, as Jews in America, made explicit political decisions to change our bedfellows and step away from some of those alliances, and the ways that Black anti-Semitism, the specter of Black anti-Semitism, were used as political and emotional cover for that retreat. That very much informs my ways of thinking about Judaism. One moment that I remember very well, because it happened in my own lifetime, was when Jesse Jackson was running for president in 1984. And he was poised to win the New York primary in 83 and would have locked up probably the Democratic nomination. And then on a hot mic, he gets caught saying Hymietown. New York City is Hymietown. And the rapidity and the severity with which he was shut down by Jewish watchdog groups like the Anti-Defamation League was very striking to me, because it involved an assumption that somehow in articulating this toothless, barely legible slur, Jesse Jackson meant the Jewish community real harm, that he harbored actual hatred for us by means of saying Hymietown. And even as a 7-year-old, I was like, this seems like some bullshit. It erased his entire history. Suddenly, Jesse Jackson was not the guy who ran on this campaign of tremendous inclusivity and progressivism. He wasn't the guy who founded Operation Push. He wasn't the guy who stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel with Martin Luther King Jr. pointing across the way at his assassin. He was just a guy who said Hymietown, and now he should be castigated and banished forever. That struck me even at that time as puzzling. And I truly believe that this was a way of semantically tarring Black supporters of Jackson's and Black Americans in general with the brush of anti-Semitism. That Jesse Jackson spoke for a large constituency when he said Hymietown, and that it was horrible and it really meant something and it was nothing he could overcome or be educated on. And thus, Black people were anti-Semitic, and we didn't have to feel bad about choosing whiteness over the Civil Rights Alliance that we'd been part of, that we still love to celebrate and talk about, but aren't really doing much to further, for the most part, the way that we might once have been. And I feel like this has played out in different ways. A Black leader says something anti-Semitic. It's then assumed that he speaks on behalf of his entire constituency and he is banished. And, you know, it's in striking contrast to the way a lot of these groups treat transgressors and people who make anti-Semitic remarks who are not black, who are white. When Mel Gibson goes on a tirade, a drunken anti-Semitic hate-filled tirade, and says the Jews are responsible for all the wars in the history of the world, he's not banished. He's invited in to talk about it and be educated and meet with the rabbis. I think in some ways, hip hop is one of the things that gave me a lens to understand what all of that looks like, and to understand that whiteness is not a static thing. And Jewish whiteness is always going to be more contingent, more liminal, less firmly rooted, because anti-Semitism is so fundamental to the praxis of white nationalism in this country. You know, you talk to people who've escaped from that movement and reinvented themselves and escaped from the ideology that filled them with so much hate. To a person, they all say that the hardest part to kind of unlearn is the anti-Semitism, because it's so central and in some ways is a blueprint for so many of the other forms of hate that those people direct at Black folks, Mexicans, LGBTQ folks, immigrants, trans kids, you name it. It's all very much rooted in that praxis.
Can you talk about what your approach is having that critique in your work, especially in your Jewish writing? And I don't mean to overstate it. I mean, I'm not saying you're the rabbi, like the Golem, you know, just you're a rabbi. What is your contribution to that emerging Talmud that we're writing today that's taking into account the kinds of things that you're talking about?
I mean, with this book, I hope that people will do some serious thinking and maybe rethinking about the nature of anti-Semitism and the various options at our disposal to combat it. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately vis-a-vis the Golem, since this book came out and since this war started, is the fact that the Golem, throughout all of the folklore and all of the disagreement about how to make him and what his job is and how to unmake him and all these things that we all disagree on in classic Jewish fashion, one thing that's very consistent is that you never allow the Golem to remain animate for any longer than is absolutely necessary. The moment that some semblance of safety has been restored, the moment the crisis has been put to rest, he is destroyed. Nobody makes a standing army of golems. Nobody makes a 1,000-foot golem to act as a perpetual nuclear deterrent. There's an understanding, I think, inherent to all of the mythology of the Golem, that he's dangerous. Even if he obeys his orders, we do not deserve or are not meant to have that kind of limitless aggression, power, violence at our disposal. Making the Golem is in some sense an imitation of God, down to the way that he is animated through the use of language, just as language is what God uses to create the world. And there's something deeply uneasy about Golem making and taking on that role, because it's a technology that we lack the wisdom and the spiritual sophistication to fully master and control. Stories of the Golem are largely stories about stepping back from power, relinquishing power, which is something that very seldom happens in the modern world in any way, on a personal level, on a societal or political or military level. But to me, that's a big part of what the Golem is. The necessity, the moral necessity of unmaking him before his presence, his existence leaches away too much of our own humanity, and we ourselves become indistinguishable from him, violent, aggressive, so forth.
So continuing on this, well, if we take artists are the new rabbis seriously front, I want to keep running with that.
Which I want to just be clear, I didn't say. That's all your boy Amakai, just so we're clear.
We are imposing it on this conversation because we like it, and we're and you're plugging yourself in to the extent that you do agree or not.
Fair.
So if artists are the new rabbis or artists are new rabbis, another takeaway we could argue, the like, if X then Y, would be that if rabbis are creators of Torah, and I don't mean Torah just in the 5 book sense, but like when rabbis write things they think about Jewish ethics or how we should be in the world, that is generally regarded as part of like oral Torah. That's not a particularly radical thing to say. That's just like the language that a lot of people use. They might have boundaries around which rabbis count as giving oral Torah, but that's like a normal thing to say. we would also come to the conclusion that if artists are the new rabbis, that what artists create is new forms of Torah. I recognize that that can come off as, I mean, people can receive that as very like anti-religious. They can receive that as me saying, oh my gosh, the Torah is only as meaningful as the books in the fiction section of the bookstore. Or they could receive it as the opposite, and what I mean with it, which is that fiction books in the bookstore absolutely have an impact on us as human beings that is comparable to Torah. And it's not that either is better. It's just, I think that on a basic level, when I read the stories in Genesis about Abraham or Sarah or Rebecca or Isaac, whatever, and then I read a book by you that's the Golem of Brooklyn, I don't think my body knows the difference. Both of them enter me, my mind or my heart or my body or whatever, as stories with the potential to have an impact on how I engage in the world and how I think about the world. And I don't think there's a difference. And I think that considering a huge status separation between official Jewish texts and The Golem of Brooklyn, a great novel, I don't think it serves us. So I'm curious, this is less about The Golem of Brooklyn than it is about Jewish fiction generally, or even fiction generally. I think you could call books that are not written to be quote unquote Jewish literature. That could affect your Judaism too. So how do you understand the role that Jewish fiction can play to affect us as Jews, as people? And is it not so ludicrous for me to argue or others to argue that these are forms of Torah?
It doesn't strike me as ludicrous at all. Stories shape and reshape us. Stories have a transformative power. Stories built on character and on moral dilemmas and choices are instructive to us. I would agree that there's not a great distinction to be drawn, or a necessary distinction to be drawn between fiction and scripture, especially if we're willing to admit that scripture is also fiction, right? Perhaps there are people who want to argue for like a literalist interpretation of everything that happens in the Torah, but I think that's a hard argument to make, right? So, then we get to like, well, if the story of Esther is fiction or the story of Abraham and Isaac is fiction, what is it created and structured to do, to elicit? My feeling is that fiction's job is to ask the difficult questions, to posit some answers or some directions, and play these things out in kind of a pocket moral universe that can be instructive for those of us listening in from a larger moral universe. It's also instructive that even in our books of law, you will still find stories. I'm reading the Talmud right now. And, in the middle of a chapter that purports to be about divorce and that's been mired for pages upon pages in incredibly boring minutia or incredibly ridiculous minutia, after 12 straight days of reading about whether a woman's courtyard is an extension of her person, or if a woman is standing on her rooftop and you want to divorce her and you throw the divorce scroll over the parapet and it catches on fire in midair, whether it's considered delivered or not, which of course depends on whether it's on the updraft or the downdraft. Like in the middle of all that, seemingly the rabbis are like, we're losing them. Quick, somebody tell the story of the destruction of the Second Temple, but tell the most batshit insane version you can. And you get to that and you're like, oh my God, this is like the most compelling story I've ever read in my life. And then with no transition whatsoever, they're like, but back to these courtyards. And you're like, what just happened? To me, that's an indication that even these rabbis, even these sages, even these creators of the Talmud had a flair and an understanding for the critical importance of storytelling. I've been thinking of that particular story daily since I read it. Do you guys know the story I'm talking about?
Yep. We're talking about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, or what are we?
Right. This guy, as a side note, I would love to hear what the fuck you make of it. I mean, really, all right, the whole story, as I understand it, this is all one page, right, of the Talmud. So this guy shows up at a dinner party, realizes he's not invited, which is also not for nothing, more or less exactly how the Trojan War starts, right? Somebody's pissed off about not being invited to a party, so they decide to burn down the world. That part is the least batshit insane part. The part that I think a lot about is, I mean, the Nero stuff is also pretty crazy. Nero shows up. and shoots arrows in 4 directions. They all land in Jerusalem. And he's like, oh, bad vibes. Then he grabs some kid, is like, what story did you learn today? The kid's like, Esau. He's like, I'm out of here. And he goes and converts to Judaism. And then gives, and his descendant is Rabbi Meir, like one of these important Talmudic rabbis. That's also not the craziest part. To me, the craziest part is when Titus shows up, sacks the temple, immediately has sex with a prostitute on top of the Torah scroll, slices the curtain separating the holiest of holies from the sanctuary, blood spurts out at him. He's like, aha, I've killed the Hebrew God. Then he takes all his loot. He gets on a boat. A wave almost capsizes it. He's like, oh, I see. The Hebrew God is only powerful in the water. He did this to the Egyptians, and now he's trying to kill me. But once I get to land, I'll be cool. He gets to land, and God immediately speaks to him. Also crazy. God is speaking to the enemies of the Jews now. God is like, may I introduce you to my friend, the gnat, the lowliest of creatures. It has a mouth, but no asshole. And the gnat flies up Titus's nose into his brain and starts pecking away at it for the next 7 years, driving Titus slowly insane. They cut him open, and the gnat is now the size of a robin. And then his son raises him from the dead to ask him if he should continue to persecute the Jews. Titus is like, is like, where are you now? And who controls the world you're in? Titus is like, the Jews. It sucks here. I get burned to ash every day. And his son is like, so I should convert to Judaism? And Titus is like, no, there's too many rules. You'll never be able to follow them all. Continue to persecute them. That shit is crazy to me. And also, what I can't stop thinking about particularly is how, if you were to summarize the last millennium of anti-Semitism in one story, you could do a lot worse than the Jews as this tiny, disgusting gnat that can't even shit, flying into the brain of the Roman emperor, the state itself, and destroying it from within. That's all the tropes right there. And this is in the Talmud. Why is it in the Talmud? What does it have to do with divorce law? Nobody knows.
So first off, that's amazing. And we had no idea we were going to go there, but I think we're embodying the very Talmudic genre you're describing, where, we're in one zone talking about a particular book, and then let's have a detour to talk about Kamsa and Bar Kamsa and Gnats and Titus and Nero and all that good stuff. I love it. I want to get to one last little thing that happened in your book, because not too long ago on this podcast, we had a series of episodes all about conversion to Judaism. And I mean, we had a lot of great conversations. Folks should go back and listen. But one of our general overarching themes was that the amount that we ask of people who are not Jewish in order to become Jewish may be wildly wrongly calibrated, and it might be too much. We may be asking too much. And you have a scene in your book that I was just like literally laughing. I laugh out loud watching shows. I don't have that many books where I'm laughing audibly. I was sitting right next to my wife, and she was like, what's going on? And there's this scene where the Golem meets a father and his daughter. We're doing all sorts of spoilers today. So like, folks, I hope you're okay with it, but like, read it anyway. He meets this father and daughter, and in order for the Golem to achieve a particular set of goals, he needs to convert these folks to Judaism, and then in return, he's gonna dig a septic tank, dig a hole in their yard. So
the Golem needs a ride to Kentucky, because at this point, Len and Miri have abandoned him, and he this 11-year-old girl who he meets while he's tromping through the woods, she's worked out a plan whereby her father will give him a ride from West Virginia to Kentucky in return for the Golem digging them a new septic field, which they need. Right.
Okay. So there it is. Now we have the context.
Right. But the Golem the Golem is down with this plan, but he can't work for a Gentile. Like, he's physically unable to do work on behalf of a Gentile. So he's like, somebody's got to convert. He's like, let me be clear. I'm not proselytizing. We don't do that. I just, it's just a workaround.
Right. So the daughter converts. There's like this whole thing with standing on one foot, because the Talmud talks about Hillel the elder, while standing on one foot, distilling all of Judaism to this pithy phrase that's, roughly the golden rule, but not exactly. And you could look at that and say, oh my gosh, that's such a fuck up. We just made somebody Jewish before they had any sense of what they're signing up for. Oh my gosh. You could also say that it seems like this young girl is grateful for it, and we don't know what the future is, but like in my head canon, she goes and becomes a rabbi. So there's that scene in your book where there's a conversion. There's a number of moments in your book where the fact of somebody's Jewishness, non-Jewishness, there's use of the word goy, goyish. It's not a word we usually use in the podcast, but I don't think you use it maliciously. There's points where the golem can smell if somebody's an anti-Semite or not. You bring a lot of real depth, I think, and layers to questions of Jewish interactions with non-Jews. And in that moment, I found it really interesting the ways in which there were characters on the precipice between the two in this conversion moment. So as a closing note, I know it wasn't the core piece of your book, but there is a lot about anti-Semitism here. The golem is somebody who fights anti-Semitism, which is, hatred of Jews by non-Jews. If you can bring us whatever thoughts you have on the ways in which Jews and non-Jews are interacting in your book and what that might apply to in our own lives.
There are a few key moments, I think, in the book where Jews and non-Jews are interacting. First of all, we talked a little bit about it, but the entire relationship between Len and his best friend Walid is indicative, I think, of an entire kind of world in which people come together across religion and across race due to shared sensibilities, due to a shared interest in living in a world that isn't defined by those things fundamentally, where a friendship like theirs can thrive and be generative and important to both of them. This moment that you talk about, which I'm grateful to you for bringing up, because in the 2 months since this book came out, you're maybe the second person to talk about this completely batshit insane scene. And when you write a book, a lot of stuff just flies under the radar. There's stuff I'm still waiting for anybody seemingly to notice or think is important enough to bring up. This scene was one that, going back to something we talked about previously in terms of structure and outline, was completely improvised and freestyle. I had no notion going into this chapter that the golem was going to convert this girl. But as soon as I came to that decision, it became very obvious to me that he should convert her while she stands on one foot, as a nod to the famous story of Hillel. I'm also struck by something you said a second ago, anti-Semitism being the hatred of Jews, because I think it gets to the heart of a lot of what I am doing in the book around the interaction of Jews and not Jews. And while I don't disagree with that, I think that there are particular ways that anti-Semitism functions that make it very different from simply the hatred of Jews by non-Jews, because unlike a lot of hatreds, it seems to me that anti-Semitism is a totalizing worldview, and it's kind of the bottom of the funnel. Like, if you are somebody who is inclined to believe that your life is controlled by forces unseen, by shady cabals, you will eventually come to blame the Jews. It's kind of where all of these conspiracies...
The word cabal comes from Kabbalah, by the way. Like, it directly proves... It comes from the notion of, like, secretive Jewish ideas. That's where the word comes from.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. There we go. But the legibility of anti-Semitism is often dependent on our understanding of this entire worldview, right? This notion that Jews are the secret puppet masters of the world who secretly control world economies and Hollywood and banks and puppeteer all sides of every war, while simultaneously being these rodent-like, vermin-like, subhuman, disgusting, stateless parasites. Somehow we're both those things at once. But like, believing both those things at once doesn't actually make any less sense than believing any one of those two things. But the ways in which you have to know all that for anti-Semitism to even be legible, I think is very different from the way some other forms of hatred work. Like when Kanye West goes on Instagram and reads out a list of Jewish Hollywood executives. If you don't understand the implication, which is that they're all working together in some kind of secret and terrible accord, then it's just a list of names. Like if he read a list of Dutch names, it would literally mean nothing. It would just be a list of names. But anti-Semitism is the thread that stitches those names together into some kind of conspiracy. And to me, that's really interesting. And in some ways sets the ideology apart from. And I'm not trying to rank them. I'm not saying one is more insidious or hateful or disgusting than another. I just think it's worth making that distinction. I don't know if any of this is getting anywhere near your question, but that's what I got for you.
Well, look, that's up to our listeners if it stayed close to my question, and maybe it's better if it didn't. I don't know how good my question was. I know your answer was really good. So that's, I think, aligned with the spirit of your book, aligned with the spirit of our podcast, to end up in places that we might have envisioned beforehand and those that are straying far from the original questions, and that's okay. So thank you so much, Adam, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you guys so much. This has been a lot of fun for me.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We want to let you know there are amazing mini courses coming up in the Onion Yeshiva. We have a bunch of really fantastic 3-week options available. You can go to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more. And you should go to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more, because you want to take these courses. We'll say a little bit more in the coming weeks, but they start in mid-January and you don't want to miss them. So judaismunbound.com/classes. Also, of course, we love when you are in touch with us. You can be in touch via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. All of our handles are at JudaismUnbound. You can send us an email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, check out the show notes for this episode, our other resources, all sorts of good stuff there to find. And we are always really, really grateful, especially this time of year, if you're able to set aside even $1, even $10, even $1 million, whatever amount to support our work. You can send us a gift at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift. And truly, sincerely, every single dollar goes a huge, long way. So we hope that as this year closes, you will be able to support us in some small fashion. And the last thing we'd say is that, of course, support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.